Welcome to today's session on presenting ideas and influencing decisions with data. So today I'd like to share some of the experience and based on my own working history, what can be done to better present the results of our analytics, the results of our activities. And also give you some tips and tricks helping you to better structure your presentations and your activities in the future. I must apologize, I have a little bit of a cold, so I may be coughing every now and then. So sorry about that. Let's keep going. All right, so what we'll be talking today was what are some of the ideas that we can use in order to communicating better with data. We also will have a look at an example of how the whole thing fits in, and I'll give you a specific example from a report from an academic journal that I have used to illustrate the points. So, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. So, here are some tables from an article in a magazine. Based on a lot of data analytics that has been done, as you can see, there is a lot of data, and this is based on analysis from 127 different reports. This was an article which was looking at the performance of the Indonesian audit office, BPKP, in relation to their audits of state governments in Indonesia. Now, you look at that, would you be able, just based on the data in the three tables that you see here, would you be able to say anything about the performance of BPKP? Would you even be able to have a guess? And by the way, those three tables represent the numbers. The article is an extremely heavy read. It's about 10 pages or something like that. I did read it when I was preparing this presentation, but I can tell you that it wasn't an easy read. So the question here is, can we actually draw any conclusions in relation to what is happening with BPKP? To be honest, when I first see something like that, the short answer for me personally is no. No idea what we can do, no idea what sort of information is here, what does it relate to, and what are the actual consequences of having that and conclusions having of that information. So things can be improved significantly. And this is where some of the ideas in this session come in. So first, when we are preparing a presentation and having our data that we'll be using to present, we need to keep in mind what is the situational background. Who are we presenting to? Are we presenting to a bunch of professionals, like, let's say, the building engineers that you see here? Are we presenting to a group of senior managers? Because senior managers have got a completely different type of requirement in relation to information from the professionals. For the professionals, we want to have a lot more detail, while senior manager would be interested in the summary and the trends in order for them to be able to make a decision and to move the organization forward. So two totally different groups. If we are preparing a presentation, we cannot use the same presentation. That's the reality. We just need to be mindful of the needs of the person or the persons that we are presenting to. Okay, after we actually present, what do we want them to do? What sort of action do we want our group to take based on our presentation? We're trying to influence them in some shape or form. We want them to agree with us. We want them to take a certain action. As an auditor, quite often when I would be presenting something, I want the business to actually do something about the risks and the problems that we have identified. What sort of other information do we need? What sort of trends are there, and what sort of, again, information we can present to the rest of the organization in order for them to do something with the information? So these are the things that we need to take into account first. This is the situation of background. Who are we presenting to? What do we want them to do? How do we want them to do that? Now, once we consider that, we then move to the next stage. These are the actual ways of how we can influence people when we are presenting. Okay. We use various types of visuals that we are using to actually show the data and the results of our analytics. The first one is just pure text. Okay, here is a figure, 31.077 trillion of something. Okay, as you can see, this is, by the way, one of the favorite approaches of Steve Jobs. He used to do it a lot when he was doing presentations. If you have a recording of some of the sessions that he's run, you can see that. So 31 trillion, all right? Single figure catches the attention, we know what it is. However, we need a little bit of context behind this thing. So let's see. Okay, so that 31 trillion is the loss due to corruption in Indonesia in 2015. Okay, all right, now we know what this means. Whoever sees the presentation very clearly can make that connection. However, what's more important, the actual figure or the background? Probably the figure, and that's why the background can be actually put a little bit behind so that it's not, doesn't hit us in the eyes as much. Just make the text underneath gray, and it is still there for the people who need to see it, but the focus is still on the actual figure, 31 trillion. In the background, we may want to actually focus the attention of our audience on the reason behind that figure. So in this case, the word corruption can be made bold or dark. Now we can see that there is 31 trillion linked to corruption. And then we can see that it's in Indonesia in 2015. So this way, we can present a piece of information which is easy to digest for our readers or for our audience. And at the same time, we provide the necessary context around. When we're doing presentations, you need to keep in mind that the analogy is something like a billboard on a highway. When we're driving on a highway with 100K or above, we don't have too much time to look at billboards. It needs to be something which is succinct, which catches our attention before we drive past the billboard. It is the same thing here. We don't want to overload mentally our audience. We want to make it as easy as possible for them to catch the idea that we're presenting to them, and then we can move on with the next part of the presentation. And here at the bottom, I put also the source of the figure, so we can actually say this figure comes from this specific place. In this case, it's the Journal of Society and Governance, where the article comes from. So this is one of the things. The simple text in a bold, big format works well. Now, another one is tables. We are all used to tables. We see tables on a daily basis in various pieces of corporate communication, so they are extremely powerful as well. Here is a table. This is, by the way, this is a real table from an audit that I did with my team in a local government authority in Australia a few years ago. And these are the findings. We had one high risk finding, one medium risk, one low risk. All right, so this is what we have, but so definitely not all of these things have got the same importance. The most important thing are the high risk findings. The low risk findings, usually no organization has the time or the money to fix them. So how about we can just emphasize that? All right, use some color. Now, traffic lights, we are all familiar with traffic lights from the streets. If we use traffic light in this specific case as a coloring scheme, it would work really well, because we all know that whatever is red, we need to pay more attention. Whatever is green is okay. So in this case, I can immediately highlight the number of high risk findings, which is 1. So now, whoever is listening to me, that was from a presentation at an audit committee, whoever is listening to me knows that they need to do, the organization will need to do something because there is a high risk finding there. Contrast that with this table. We don't have too much information here. What is it? Apart from the fact that in the first column, we have the names of each row, and these are also abbreviations, so not exactly something that we can easily understand what it is. We can have a fairly good guess, but not much. This table doesn't give us information, okay? It can, but it certainly is not structured in the way to make it easy for our audience. Another type of visual is the heat maps. Heat maps are tables with another dimension thrown in, the color. So different shades of color signify different things. Here is a real example of a table from a report on fraud in organizations. The darker the shade of the cell, the higher the number and the bigger the problem, respectively. So as we can see, as I look at the table, the first thing that I will see is 33%, because it's the darkest number. What's 33%? Well, this is billing fraud in healthcare. This is the worst case scenario of them all. All right, cool. I then will have a look, and if I look at the other way, what is the smallest problem? Well, those light colored cells, I can see that in the insurance area, last row, cash, larceny, and cash on hand is not really a problem. And in the government and public administration, second row, cash and check and payment tampering are not a problem. Okay. So immediately I can grasp where the biggest problems are, and I can focus my attention. So if I'm presenting, I'll color that, I'll present a heat map, and immediately I'll say, by the way, at healthcare, we have 33% billing fraud, and then we need to do something with it. Okay. So heat maps are very powerful here. And again, at the bottom, I put again the source of the information so that actually I can back up any claims that I make in my presentation. It's always good to put the source. Just keep in mind that the source is not the most important thing. That's the reality. Okay, another one is simple lines. As you can see here, lines, 1 or 2 lines give us a lot of information. We can notice trends immediately. The 2 lines on the left have a dip, and then they go back up. Doesn't matter what it is. On purpose, I didn't put the legend here, but as you glance at the line, you can start immediately understand what are some of the relationships and what are the trends. There's another one, which is a real statistics on the right, synthetic fraud rate compared to overall fraud rate, and how it's percent of total population. I can see immediately that the red line is much worse than the other one, and the red line is the synthetic identity fraud, synthetic fraud rate versus overall fraud rate. Lines are very powerful, they are simple, and we need to use them as much as possible. The next type of visual is the so-called slope graph. Really good to compare 2 points, two periods or 2 points of data of some kind. It can be time data, it can be any other data. What you see here, for example, on the right-hand side, that comes back from the same report that I mentioned before, certified from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. We have whistleblower communication channels, all right? And across 2 points, 2018 and 2020. And you can see immediately what's going up and what's going down. There are two, which the phone and the letters are going down as a communication channel. Well, that's not really a surprise. At the same time, email and web forms are going up. If we dig deeper, we can see that phone usage has decreased significantly, while web forms and emails are increasing quite substantially. So in this case, the outcome of looking at that graph and the outcome of a recommendation is, all right, so maybe the hotline that we have for fraud is not as important anymore. We need to leave it there, but don't pay too much attention. Don't give it additional funding. But what we need to think about is maybe create a separate email address where people can send us tips about occurring fraud, or create some sort of a web form, some data collection mechanism on our intranet or somewhere outside the organization in order to actually allow people who are more technology savvy or who prefer to use more anonymous means of communication as opposed to phone to actually send us tips. The thing is that some people don't like to use phone for whistleblowing, okay? Because they fear that their voice may be recognized and there can be some consequences. But in this case, the slope graph gives us a pretty good snapshot of what's going on, and we can then continue. Another one is the bar charts. Very powerful, very popular, and for a good reason. In relation to bar charts, I want to mention one thing. Most people prefer to use vertical bar charts, but horizontal bar charts actually work much better, simply because when we read the categories on the left and we immediately glance, before even seeing the bar chart, we'll read what is on the y-axis, and we know immediately what each bar relates to. Of course, this is applicable to countries that write left to right. If you are in a country that writes the other way, right to left, then you may want to reverse the location of the y-axis, but the principle remains. Horizontal bar charts are very powerful because the first thing that we read is actually a description of the value on that specific bar. And it allows the viewer or the audience to much easier grasp what the bar represents. Another powerful one is a map. And here on this map, you can see that it's a mixture of a map and heat map, actually. But you can see, without paying too much attention or without being too hard, you can see that the dark areas at the bottom, there is a legend, employee count in thousands. You can see immediately that this company specifically has got a lot of people in India. And then there is a lot of people in China, second one. Not many people in Africa. There is a few people in Australia and US. Nobody in Canada, so they don't have any employees in Canada. Very few people in Mexico, and Africa, almost nowhere in Africa, except at the bottom. Also, they have some employees in Russia. Very quickly, I can grasp what's going on without putting too much mental effort. And this is the most important thing. We want to make it, as I said earlier, we want to make it as easy as possible for the reader or for the audience, if we're presenting live, to understand what we want to tell them. The one thing about the visuals is the 3D. 3D is the favorite of a lot of people. I must admit my sin. I used to be doing the same thing and using 3D a little bit too much, I think. But the problem with 3D can be extremely misleading. You can see here 2 lines, and if okay, one of them is revenue, the other one is expenditure. So expenditure is orange, revenue is blue. In Q2, revenue is below the expenditure, so obviously we have a loss in Q2. The question is, how big is the loss? When I look at the chart like that, the loss seems to be quite sizable. The way I'm seeing it, it's somewhere around 740 revenue, about 840 expenditure, so it's about $100,000 loss. If you look at it in 3D, but if I look at it in normal 2D, actually the loss is, in reality, the loss is much smaller. The loss is not 100,000. The loss seems to be about 20,000, so 5 times less. So just compare this to this. Immediately you see the real situation. So be careful, because 3D may look prettier, but at the same time it's also very misleading. So if you want to convince your audience that Q2 wasn't that bad and the loss wasn't that bad, you shouldn't use that, because they won't believe it. It's much better actually to use this, where you can see straight away that the loss really is not that big. So now we also need to try and keep things as simple as possible. There are some principles of design, the so-called Gestalt principles of design, which show us how we visually group things and how we can apply them to the design of our visualizations. Number 1 is proximity. Objects which are closer together seem to be related. Same thing with similarity. Objects which are similar, like if you look at the top right picture, we have triangles, circles which are full, or circles which are empty, or circles with a dot. But because they are similar, we intuitively just put them together. So we can actually use some of these things to simplify the elements on our visualization, just by putting things together, or making them similar, or putting them with some sort of a mental closure. Like as you can see here, bottom left, doesn't matter that the square is not fully drawn. Every single one of us can see that there is a square in the middle. So actually, this is what the brain automatically extends those lines. It encloses everything in a square. So we can use that when we're designing our visualizations. But we talk about that in the session, the 4-hour session that we run here at MBS Academy. So, but some of the things that we can talk about here is, how can we make things simple in order to remove the mental overload and still leave all of the information that we need there. Here is an Excel chart. All right, it's not that full of various elements, but still it's possible to improve it. And actually, this is what it can be presented as. Now, look at the chart on the left, look at the chart on the right. Okay, chart on the right doesn't have the markers. Do we really need the markers to tell us where the points are, or those little squares, like the blue squares on the left chart, or the orange triangles? Not really, they don't add anything. We can safely remove them. Do we need the grid lines from the y-axis? Maybe yes, maybe no, but if we're presenting to a senior manager, I'll probably remove the lines, simply because they're interested in the trends. They're not interested specifically in the details, how much is the profit in Q4, in which case I need a line in order to be able to work out that it's about 890. But for a senior manager, they see that the profit is much higher than the loss. So this is basically the information they will need in most of the times. Of course, there are exceptions, but I'm talking in general. However, if we are presenting to engineers, remember the first slide, then I'll probably leave the grid lines coming from the y-axis. But try to simplify as much as possible. This is my advice. We can do the same thing with tables. So here's the table that I showed you earlier. Yeah, it presents the information. It draws the attention to the important things. Is it a little bit overbearing? Well, personally, I think it is. How can we improve it? Well, what's the most important part of the table? The most important part is the numbers. Okay, so if that's the case, we can make the numbers stand out. Leave the numbers bold and black and put the column headings as gray. We already know that our attention is drawn by the color. Okay, so in the first column, which is red, there is something one. What exactly does it represent? Let's give it 0.1 second, but our attention is drawn there immediately. So this way, I'm focusing the attention of the audience where I want it to be. Can we improve the table a little bit more? Yes, we can. Because do we really want those borders which are overwhelming? I don't think that they add too much to the presentation. So, excuse me, we can remove the borders. We can leave the numbers. We can leave the background colors. We can leave the gray column headings. The table at the bottom presents the information in an easy to digest way, and while keeping all of the details that we need there. Another thing, we sometimes, to make it easier for the audience, we can use other things or other ideas to draw attention. If you look at these 4 lines here, it's very difficult to work out what's the most important one. Usually I get the answer when I run it as a course. I get the answer, the red one is the most important one, probably because red is associated with danger or some sort of warning, and probably because it's the darkest color. But in reality, it's not. We don't know what is the most important one out of these 4. Or we'll leave the audience guessing. And not everybody thinks that the red is the most important. Usually 30–40% of the people think that red is the most important line. When I ask a question, the other equally spread between the other 3 colors. So one way to draw the attention of someone is actually to make the important line a little bit thicker. If you look at this chart here at the bottom, the one that I want to focus everybody's attention is actually the thick one. And I even put, and there can even be an arrow at the end. That definitely will draw the attention of everyone. Here's an example, going back to the slope graphs. Now I want to focus everybody's attention on the web form because we need to get budget to fund the development of that communication channel for whistleblowers. So my presentation is about the importance of web forms, in which case, but because as you can see here, the web form usage has increased by about 50% in 2 years. So I want to draw everybody's attention there. I have made that line thicker than the rest of them. As soon as it's on the screen, everybody will be focused there. There are other ways of doing drawing attention using color. If you look here now, as you can see, I've drawn the attention of everybody to the right part of the graph just by making the background a little bit darker. In practical terms, this is what it looks with the chart with the slope graphs from earlier. Now I focused everybody's attention on 2020. Of course, focusing attention in one way doesn't mean that you cannot focus in another way. So I could have left the web form chart a little bit thicker, but I'm talking about 2020, what's happening. So I want to actually focus the attention of the audience on 2020. These are the figures for 2020. Next in my next slide of the presentation, hypothetical presentation, I can draw the attention to the audience just to web forms by making the web form line a little bit thicker. So you can play with various combinations, but background color is one way to draw attention. Thickness is another way to draw attention. Another thing to keep in mind is appearance of text. When we are putting stuff on a slide, we need to keep text to a minimum. I honestly hate presentations where all of the text is on the slide and the presenter is reading off the slides. I try to avoid it as much as possible, unless I'm actually preparing a presentation to give away after that as a PDF file. But during the presentation, no. So, but we still need some text. Okay, so here's a key point of something that we need to emphasize. Now the first thing, do not use, please, any funky fonts. It's much easier to read the first line versus the second line. Yes, the second line is readable, although there are some fonts that make it extremely hard on everybody. But why do you need a funky font? It doesn't show any creativity, but I think personally, it makes it difficult for the reader to understand what's there. It's much better actually if we just make it simple. So stick, especially for digital presentations like this one, stick to the Arial type fonts, which are the so-called sans serifs. Nice and clean, they work best on screen. If we want to emphasize a little bit, we can use bold, but please use it sparingly as the other things that I'll show you shortly. So bold is one way to emphasize. Italic is a different way to emphasize, not as hard as bold, but still can be used to draw the attention to the reader to a text. And then the most powerful way to emphasize text is when you underline it. And it is important not to overuse it. If you underline everything, nothing's important. If everything's important, nothing's important. So underline needs to be used sparingly, but as soon as our eye sees an underlined text, it will stop there and reread it. Okay, so we see a paragraph, immediately we are drawn to the underline. This is the things that we read first. As we start reading, we will stop at the underline again, we'll reread it. So just keep that in mind. Stick to a simple font, no funky things. The most powerful way to emphasize something is with underline, and the least powerful way is with italic. Now, also one of the things to keep in mind on charts, the title is a very precious part of the chart. This is the first thing that we use, so use it wisely. Try to convey the most important piece of information. Newspapers know that, they've known that for ages, and that's why the titles in the newspapers are something that would catch your attention and will stop you and think, because the title of an article is the one that needs to make us buy the newspaper. So newspaper journalists have known that for ages, but we in our presentations can use exactly the same approach. Whatever you want to say, which is important, put it in the chart title to emphasize the information that you will be presenting. So these were some of the things some of the tactics, little things that would make the presentations more powerful and easy to grasp. But what about the strategy? Well, the strategy is actually to have a story of some kind. This is Aristotle, the ancient Greek, and he has advice for storytellers that each story has to have a beginning. It has where the problem is stated. It has to have a middle, which shows how the problem can be resolved in some shape or form. And then it needs to have an end where the happy ending comes and the problem is resolved and everybody is extremely happy and everything's great. This is what I actually did today. The beginning was when I showed you the three tables which can scare you just by looking at them. Okay, how do you make sense of that? Well, realistically, it's not that easy unless you go and read the whole article, but that's not the point. Nobody's got the time to do that. In the middle, we talked actually about how to resolve that problem of too much data, which doesn't make any sense. Well, these are some of the tactics that we have discussed. How to communicate well with data, situational background, types of visuals, and so on and so on. And then, at the end, we need to have some resolution of the problem from the start, from the beginning, right? Okay, too much data, we need to make sense of it. How can we do that? So, right, we need to tell a story. Our story is that BPKP is doing a great job. That's the National Audit Office of Indonesia, based on these three tables. Okay, so I've said that, and then I showed you the data, and I don't think that I have convinced too many people, simply because, yeah, Mario, that's right. There's a lot of numbers here which make sense to no one. And no, we're not exactly convinced that whatever you're saying here is true. So the question is, how can we improve this situation? So let's see what's happening here. This is the real story. 31.1 trillion rupiah was lost to corruption in Indonesia in 2015. BPKP did 128 audits and a report after each of the audits between 2012 and 2015. And they uncovered 1.29 fraud cases on average in each provincial government. Some governments had 0, some governments were above 4. But on average, 1.29 fraud cases in each provincial government over 3 years. The average audit opinion was 3.87. Audit opinions go from 1 to 4. Different organizations adopt different scale, but 1 to 4 is actually quite common. And number 4 being unqualified, which is the top. Everything's absolutely beautiful in that organization. 1 is adverse. Basically, the world is falling apart pretty much. Now, we have a look that it's actually 3.87. That's a pretty good result across all of the provincial governments in Indonesia. That's why it's a big text, and it's also in green. If the average audit opinion was below 2, I probably would have put the text, the color of the text, something like red or dark amber, just to emphasize the point that things are not that great. So we have 128 reports. There are 1.29 fraud cases that have been uncovered. The average audit opinion in each of the reports is 3.87. So we can actually say that BPKP is highly effective in monitoring the operation of the provincial governments, because fraud cases are low, average audit opinion is high. Obviously, BPKP is doing their job. Provincial governments know that. They are also putting in place the proper mechanisms to pass an audit. And BPKP is highly effective according to President Law number 192 from 2014. So this is the story. BPKP is doing a great job here versus BPKP is doing a great job based on the data. Well, I don't think that anybody would believe anything here. People are much more likely to actually believe that when they are presented with these charts in this way. Of course, I need to say something here that if we are actually preparing a presentation to be read, not to be delivered like now, then there needs to be a little bit more information here or there in order to put things into context. But of course, try again not to overwhelm the person. So live presentation is one thing, reading something is a totally different thing. So we need more information. We also need to take into account the fact that people are not, maybe they're not going to read everything in one go. Maybe they'll start reading, then put it aside because the phone rang, or because if they're at home one of their kids came to them and asked them something. So can be different situations, but the method of delivery is also very important, but we don't have the time to get into that here. So this is the end of the presentation for today.